Okay, we're rolling, so whenever you're ready.
You just give me a second. Okay, today is Friday, July 17th, 1992. I am Janice Kettler, interviewing Lotte Magnus for the Oregon Holocaust Resource Center Oral History Project. We are at the Portland Jewish Academy in Portland, Oregon. Assisting with the interview and camera today are Eric Harper and Joanna Miller. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
Okay, how about yourself?
Not too bad.
Thank you for coming. I'd like to ask you to begin by telling us your full name, the spelling, and the date and place of your birth.
Okay. My first name is Lotte, L-O-T-T-E. There's no I in it. And I've adapted the middle name of Waite, and I use the initial W. The last name is Magnus, M-A-G-N-U-S.
And how do you spell Waite?
W-A-I-T.
Okay. And what is your present address?
17254 Southwest El Dorado Drive, Tigard, Oregon, 97224.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. And the place of your birth?
Oh, I was born in Frankfurt on the Main in Germany on March 17th, 1920.
Okay.
And they tell me that though my brother was born at home, he's 6.5 years older, I was born in the hospital, which at that time was quite a novel proceeding. And my childhood was, I don't know, it seemed natural to me. When I was about 2 years old, we got a maid who was to stay with us for 16 years. And she became quite an important factor in my life because my mother needed to go to work with my father. After a few years, as my father became an invalid, he had lost his hearing. And as I said, I have an older brother. His name is Hans, H-A-N-S, Ernst. And we both went to a Jewish school in Frankfurt. In fact, my mother went to that school as well, which had some repercussions on me when I was going to school there later on. She was an excellent student, and I wasn't, and some of the teachers I had were already on the faculty when she went to school. And German teachers are not known for their tact. And one of them had the audacity to stand in front of the class at one time and said, "You are a daughter of Lily Rothschild? I can't believe that she has such a dumb child." Which made me feel real good, of course. But that's the way things were. My father had a business, wholesale articles that were needed in the tailoring and seamstress trade, which in Germany was quite a large activity because very few people, women especially, got their clothing ready-made. And he supplied the requirements for such an enterprise to keep functioning. And as I said, it was all done on a wholesale level. Before he became an invalid, he was doing a lot of the traveling, but he had to give that up because he lost his hearing. And we had salespeople who were out on the road. And I always felt that we were fairly well off, middle-class people. My brother, who is 6.5 years older, as I said before, has different remembrances, and that's one of the points where we have arguments at times because he'll tell me that isn't the way it was. And I finally gotten around to speaking up to him, telling him, you have your memories and I have mine. And we leave it at that. And the parents of my mother lived just a few houses away from us most of the time. and I was in contact with them. I especially enjoyed being together with my grandfather. He also was quite a hiker, especially on Sundays with some of his cronies. They'd go into the mountains close to Frankfurt, which are called Taunus, Taunus. And at times he would take me along, and that was always a treat because there was this little girl among those 4 or 5 older men who weren't all that old now that I'm past that age myself. But at that time they seemed like old sages, but they were very nice to me, so I always had a good time. My grandmother was quite a different story. She was quite a strict personality, and in later years I found out that she really didn't mean to be that way, but that's the way she came across to a small child, and it wasn't always a pleasure to go see her, but in those days you went ahead and did what your parents told you to. And then my mother had 2 sisters. The youngest one, Elsa, lived with my grandparents. She had never married. And the middle one, my mother being the oldest, was married and lived in the city. And they had a daughter who's 2 years younger than I am, with whom I have a lot of contact at this time. And we've become better acquainted since we don't live in the same city. Her name is Kitty Tohar, Tohar, and she lives in Israel. Her maiden name was Ettlinger, Ettlinger. We always got along well at home too. We just didn't have too much contact. They lived in a different part of town from us, and had their acquaintances in different circles than we did. And but we girls got together fairly often. And let's see, where do you want me to go from here?
In your household, your mother and your father
And my
your
brother.
and then after you were 2 years old,
This maid.
Could you give me everybody's full name?
Oh yes, hers. Her full name was Louise Nörper. That's N-O-umlaut-R-P-E-R.
Louise was the maid.
That was the maid, yes. Mm-hmm. And whom else did you?
Mother.
Oh, my mother, Lily Goldsmith, Goldschmidt. It wasn't Americanized. My father's first name was Adolf.
Is that with an F or a PH?
An F. Mm-hmm.
What was your mother's maiden name?
Rothschild. And of course, the names Rothschild and Goldschmidt are quite well known in the wealthier circles of German Jewry. When I was a little girl, I was just sure that we were connected with them, but we weren't. It left a good impression in me. And then when I was about 6 years old, I started school, and as I said, it was a Jewish school. And that school was called Philanthropien. That's spelled Philantropin. And it was the liberal of the two, the more liberal of the 2 Jewish schools in town. The other one was strictly for the very Orthodox congregation. In our school, we also had some non-Jewish children that were from either mixed marriages or religious sects that were not really accepted by the Gentiles either. I think we had one Mormon child and one Unitarian and some other offbeat things. I don't recall what they were, and I doubt that I ever knew. But as I recall, we didn't have any animosity to these other children. They were all part of the same group. The schooling in Germany at that time was 4 years of elementary school. You had the same teacher throughout those 4 years, and then you separated into either not really vocational, but not academic schooling and academic. You had to pass a test in order to qualify for the academic. Also, this whole Jewish school, even though my parents paid taxes to the state, was a school for which my parents had to pay tuition. And that, of course, continued in high school, but it was a recognized school in the German government. And let's see. As I said, I started in 1926. The school was within walking distance of our home. We lived in an apartment in a house in Frankfurt. Apartment living was the standard for anybody in Germany at that time. It was very seldom that anybody had a house of their own. Now, this cousin of mine, whom I mentioned before, Kitty Toha, her family had a house of their own. But they were the only ones in my acquaintanceship that I can recall. And the school, besides offering the mandatory subjects, we also had a Jewish religion class, and someplace along the line we started to learn Hebrew. I don't remember just at what level, but it was the Hebrew that was used in the prayer books, not the Ivrit, the spoken Hebrew. Don't forget, this was in 1926 when the Nazis had not descended upon us yet. School was not the most pleasant activity of mine, but it was a necessary evil. And because I didn't particularly enjoy it, I didn't put forth any effort, and I was a very mediocre student, as this teacher so correctly said, but he didn't have to say it that way. And when I got into the upper grades, about the 5th and 6th grade, I started to become active in a Jewish Pathfinders organization. And that was really a lot more interesting than going to school. And a lot of my activities and energies were put towards that. And by that time, Hitler had started to rear his ugly head, and my father was very perceptive. In the very beginning already, he said that Hitler is going to be no good for the Jews. And for that reason, the parents did not object to my being involved in this Pathfinders group, because he could see that perhaps there would be an opportunity to help me in the future.
Could you tell us more about the Pathfinders group? What kind of group was it?
It was a group of mixed sexes. By the way, in school, girls and boys were kept strictly apart. That's why this mixed sexes came out just now. But in the Pathfinders group, we were together with the boys all the time. However, within the individual smaller groups, we stayed within our sexes. And there was one leader usually, and then we did different things that kids that age and like in Scouts do. It was fashioned very much along the Scouting movement. I don't remember the names of the English gentleman who started it. Was there a Balfour? Oh, I don't remember. But at one time I knew all those things. It was a long time ago. Should I have told you to cut it before I had a drink of water? Okay.
Was it a Zionist organization?
Yes. That my father was not so keen on, but he took it in stride.
Why was he not so keen on that?
Well, he didn't really support the idea of eventually going to Israel, to Palestine at that time. That was not quite his cup of tea. Basically, he was a good German, and even though he was Jewish, he felt that his German affiliation was one of his major affiliations, and of course he was hoping against hope that things would not turn bad in Germany, but that was a little difficult. And anyhow, this group met at least once a week, and we also went on weekend excursions, overnights, and to summer camps and things of this sort. And it became a more and more needed and active group as time went on.
What year did you join the group? Do you recall?
Oh, I don't recall exactly. I would think probably around 1931 or 32.
So you were about 11 or 12?
Yes. Maybe even a little bit later. Maybe it was after Hitler came to power, which would have been in 33. And of course I left already in 1934, but I'm jumping ahead here.
If I may, I want to
Yes.
go back again to grandparents.
Okay.
Can you describe your father's parents and your relationship with them and his family?
My father's parents, both of them were dead by the time I was born. In fact, they were already dead when my mother married my father in 1913. My father did have, he was one of 6 children. He was the youngest of the 6. There were 3 girls and 3 boys. And they lived in 2 different small villages, not too far from Frankfurt, and we visited them at times. I spent summer vacations with one uncle, that was Uncle Salomon, and his 2 children who were still alive, Erna and Herman. He'd lost one son in the First World War. These cousins were quite a bit older than I, because my father being the youngest of 6, all my cousins on my father's side were older than I. And but as I said, I at times would visit this uncle and enjoyed that very much. He lived in a little larger community, and in comparison to where the others lived, it was like a big city. And that suited me better, because the others that all lived in that same place called Lindheim, Lindheim, that was strictly country, and I mean strictly country, cows and chickens running around wild, in the house and out of the house, and it wasn't quite my cup of tea. They were awfully good people. It just wasn't my way of liking to live.
Did your father grow up in a country town?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And I guess he only had high school schooling, which was quite something even at that time. And my mother did also. I really don't know too much about my father's background because of not having any grandparents around to talk to. And the handicap that befell my father early in my life was that he became deaf, and it became very difficult to talk to him unless you were writing things down. He could still speak and all that, but you never, he could not answer your questions that you were asking unless you wrote them down, or unbeknownst to me, when I learned to speak, I moved my lips more than the ordinary person, and that way my father could read a lot of things off my lips. I didn't find out about having that ability and doing it subconsciously until I was an assistant in one of the junior colleges in Illinois. So that was a long time before I found this out. But let's see. Perhaps I should try to tell you a little bit about how it came that I came to the United States, or do you want to ask some other questions?
Maybe just a few more questions about
Sure.
your life in Germany. What about the practice of Judaism in your father's original family and your mother's original family?
I think on my mother's side it was quite liberal. My father came from a rather orthodox background. We kept a kosher household and went to services every Friday evening. No, wait a second. On Saturday mornings we usually went, and Friday evenings the brocha was said and the Sabbath welcomed in. And the Friday evening meal was always a more festive meal. And all the Jewish holidays were kept. My brother had a nice bar mitzvah, and I didn't. At that time, they were not doing anything for girls, and that was always something that made me feel quite inferior, being the second born and a girl besides, and being the sister of the only grandson on my mother's side of the family. And even now, quite often, I feel inferior to my brother because of that stigma that was put upon me, but it's something I've learned to live with. What can I do?
What kind of a synagogue was it that you went to?
A Reform. Mm-hmm. And it no longer stands in Frankfurt. It was burned at the Holocaust time. And they have a remembrance plaque of that synagogue in the area where it used to be. I saw it this summer. And but there also, the synagogue was strictly something that you had to go to. There was no training connected with it for the children or anything. Of course, going to a Jewish school and having the exposure to the Jewish background there was really enough. Who wanted to do more of it? And
what about the neighborhood where you lived? Were there many Jewish families?
Yes, there were quite a few. In fact, in Frankfurt, throughout the city, there were a lot of Jewish families. Frankfurt had, next to Berlin, the largest Jewish contingent always in within the city limits. And Frankfurt has always been very appreciative, well, I shouldn't say very appreciative, but very tolerant of the Jews. And the Jewish people never, at least I never had the feeling that I was different from the other people in the city. But maybe it's just because I'm rather naive about things like that. It takes an awful lot to get under my skin.
Did you encounter any type of anti-Semitism before?
I can't recall any of it, no. I had one girlfriend who was Gentile. She happened to live in the same house where I lived, so that was very convenient. We were together a lot because of the proximity. And I never felt anything detrimental between us or her parents. She was an only child. Her parents took care of the apartment house in which we lived. But I was in and out of their apartment all the time. However, I was not allowed to eat anything there, especially no meats, because of them being not kosher. And I remember one time they were having potato pancakes and bacon, and it smelled so good. And the man of the family said to me, "You know, there are a lot more sins coming out of people's mouths than going in." But I didn't do it. I didn't even taste the potato pancake because I knew it was being fried in the fat of the bacon. However, the first time I did bacon, I thought, gee, this is delicious stuff. And I still like it.
How did your father lose his hearing? What happened?
Well, there my brother and I have different opinions. My opinion is that during the First World War, he had the flu that was in epidemic proportions all over the world. But he was stationed close to home and was able to come home every evening. So he wasn't about to turn himself into the infirmary in the service, because they would have kept him then, and when he was well again, they would have shipped him out probably, and he was just fairly newly married, had a small son at home. He wasn't about to let go of that, so mother tried to doctor him as well as she could, but from what I remember, it was a situation where the infection was never really quite cleared up, and it eventually affected all of his hearing organs, and they needed to be excised, because otherwise it would have gone into the brain. It might even have started to go into the brain somewhat, because in later years there was a question at times about my father's ability to reason correctly, but who knows? At that time, diagnostics were not what they are now. And because of that, then he was completely deaf. He was in institution for a while to become adjusted to that idea. I understand that it was quite a shock to his system, naturally, and his psyche. He was a fairly young man, 1920. Let's see, he was born in 78, so he was in his early 40s when this happened. And
how does your brother explain what happened?
I don't really know. He just tells me that I'm wrong.
But you don't know his view?
No, at least I can't think of it right now. If it comes to my mind while we're talking, I'll bring you up to date. But
well, related to that question, I was also wondering how your brother described the life that you had in Germany differently than you did. You said you were a member of the middle class.
Mm-hmm. Well, he always, I've just found this out within the last 10 years, he always felt that we were much poorer than any of our acquaintances. And I questioned him about that once and came to realize that because of him being older than I, he was dating, of course, and dating at that time took money like it does now, and he always felt that he had much less money at his disposal than his friends in order to have a good time with the group. And of course, I never experienced anything like that. I know I never got an allowance. I don't think Hans did either. It wasn't customary that you gave your children a regular allowance. And to be perfectly frank, my brother's life was something else again, because I just didn't interact that much with him. 6.5 years between a boy who was adored in a Jewish family and a girl in a Jewish family wasn't all that close. And we were not enemies or anything like that, but it was just a different generation at that level in our lives.
Which parent were you closer to?
I don't really know. I loved my father very much. It was just difficult to communicate with him, and he spoiled me. I was his little baby. And with my mother, of course, you could talk and discuss things and all that much easier than with my father. If you were discussing something with my father, it was more that he was talking about it, whereas you couldn't break in because he couldn't catch what remarks you were making. But we got along beautifully. For one thing, for instance, he was very good with figures. And also the railroad schedules in Germany are very exact, and you can really rely upon them. And he and I used to sit down with this thick book of railroad schedules that is available and figure out imaginary trips where we'd maybe have 1 or 2 minutes between connections and stuff like that. That was a lot of fun. Also on Sunday mornings, very often I'd go for a walk with him. And I remember one time we were at the zoological garden, which was just across the street from us, and we were sitting on one of the benches, and the ground was sand. And with his cane, he would mark mathematical problems into the sand and had me solve them. and things like that. And doing it in this type of writing, of course, we could communicate without words. And that to me was always a lot of fun, to do those things with my father. And my brother remembers that also, because we both are mathematically inclined, and both of our parents were quite good at it. And of course, it was one area where I could communicate very nicely with my father. We used to do it at times on a piece of paper too, in the apartment. So in that respect, I was close to my father, but because of the loss of hearing, I never did find out too much about his background, at least not from him. I did find out from his brothers and sisters, but not too much either. They didn't go into any details. I just knew that he was born in a very small place, and from there he was sent away to school for a few years, I guess, and then eventually he made his way into Frankfurt and went into business. And I think out of the 6, he was the first one who went away from a country-type setting into a city. And my mother grew up in Frankfurt. She was, yes, I'm quite sure that she was born in Frankfurt. And as I said before, she was the first of 3 daughters. And her father also was in some sort of business. He never had quite the knack to make a success of it. It was always a little bit precarious, but they made a living on it. And I always said that my grandfather, I always called them Opa and Oma, which is the German designation, that my Opa was a real good schnook. And I enjoyed being with him, especially in comparison to my Oma, who was that very strict person. I think I need to take a drink of water.
Would you like to take a break or continue?
No, I think I can go on.
Okay. Well, let's move on then to when did you first notice that things were starting to change, that attitudes toward Jews in Frankfurt were changing?
Well, this became very apparent right away when I joined that Pathfinders group, because that was one of the drawing points of theirs, that to bring us, the youngsters, into these organizations. There were a number of them in Frankfurt because of the political situation changing and going into the Zionism movement, and with the idea that we will not be able to stay in Germany indefinitely and need to have a place to go to. And most of us didn't have any connections to come to the United States or England or any of those places. And of course, Palestine was an open area, so to speak, for Zionists. And that all kind of evolved between play and politics, with kids 12, 13 years old. You don't go too deeply, especially in Germany. Youngsters that age in Germany at that time were much more immature than here. And I found that out, especially once I came to this country, that I was just like a babe in comparison to the youngsters my age here. But at that, because of this affiliation with the Pathfinders, I became aware of things going on. You saw the swastika, you saw the brown shirts, and some of your Gentile acquaintances didn't chum around with you quite so much anymore. And I noticed a little distancing with this girl who lived in the same house with me. And perhaps I was distancing myself from her too. It's a 50-50, you know. You have these instinctive feelings, and it can't always be really labeled as to what was going on. But
I'm sorry.
go ahead.
Do you remember your first sighting of a swastika?
No.
Where would you see them?
Oh, on flags and drawn against the walls of buildings, graffiti, like you see graffiti here too. Not as much as it's done now, but then in the papers there would be pictures and things like that. You just became aware of things. There was one magazine out, I don't know if it came out weekly or not, but it was similar to Life magazine, nothing but almost nothing except photographs, and there you started to see more and more of the Hitler movement described in photography, and you became aware of it. Of course, in our school you didn't see anything like it. However, a lot of the Jewish children did not go to a Jewish school. They went to the Gentile schools, and they became very much aware of it. And we had a number of youngsters in this youth organization that came from Gentile schools at that time, and they would tell us things that were going on. And of course, they became more and more exposed to being ostracized because of being Jewish, and eventually they were expelled from all the Gentile schools. And in about 1933, we started to have a large influx of additional students in the Jewish school that I went to, because these youngsters all needed to remain in school, and they could only come to either our school or the strictly Orthodox one. But if they were Orthodox, then they would have been in that school anyhow, because as far as I could tell, no Orthodox family ever sent their children to a non-Jewish school. So that was the area where I really noticed that something was going on, because suddenly our classrooms were so much fuller, and there was no possibility of having additional, teachers and additional classes, because the building was full already. And some of those students who came to our school I knew very well, because we were socially connected with their families. My parents belonged to a large lodge, and many of them belonged to that. And I'm thinking especially of one woman, one girl, with whom we had been in and out of each other's apartments for years, and suddenly Irmgard shows up at our school too, and that's when it hit me really that things were changing for the kids that were going to non-Jewish schools.
Did the teachers talk about what was happening in school to the students?
I don't remember. I just don't remember.
What about at home?
At home there was talk about it, yes. And that's where I heard my father say that this Hitler is not going to be any good for Jews. Also by that time, the anti-Semitism made itself felt in the business, and I could tell that at that time I started to realize that our financial situation was deteriorating. And I know at one time our maid went without her salary for 1 or 2 months. It didn't make her antagonistic towards the family at all, but I heard the remark, and she stayed with us long after I left even. She was a very loyal person. But I know that things like that were going on, that money was getting tight.
Was she Jewish?
No, she was a Gentile woman. She was very young when she came to us, in her early 20s, and she had never married, and she wouldn't the rest of her life either. She only died last fall. Got to be 89 years old.
And you had a close relationship with her?
Yes, because, see, my mother was in the business with my father, And she and I were together all the time. In the mornings I was in school and she would take care of the household, and in the afternoons she was like my governess, and we did things together. And I think that was one of the reasons why she enjoyed so much being with us, because like she once told me, in the mornings I'm the maid at the Goldschmidts, in the afternoons I'm the governess, which was quite a step up. And so we usually went downtown in the afternoons, or she'd take me to a park and things like that. She was really the one to whom I would very often come with my problems first, because she was always available. And it was difficult to leave her too, as well as my parents, when I did leave. Maybe we should start talking a little bit about how I left Germany.
And what was your reaction to all this talk about Hitler? What did you think? Did people start talking about leaving? Was it frightening?
It was frightening and also exciting, because a new adventure, you know. You could figure on maybe going someplace else than just staying in Frankfurt all your life. And that to a youngster is kind of challenging. It's going like going on a vacation. And that's one of the reasons why the idea of the Pathfinders group was so appealing, because we were doing everything with the idea in mind that we were going to go to Palestine as a group. That was our idea, that we would start a kibbutz. And it never came about, because things deteriorated so much faster in Germany, and it became more difficult to find an opportunity to get trained in order to become to be qualified to open a kibbutz. And then the youngsters didn't all leave together like we had originally thought it would happen. Like in my case, I left already in November of 1934. And in September sometime, I came home from school early in the afternoon, and our maid met me at the door, and she was crying terribly, and I thought something had happened to my father. And she said, "No, go see your mother." She wouldn't, the maid wouldn't tell me what it was all about. So I went to see my mother. She was in the living room, and I asked, "What's going on? Why is Isa crying so?" And she said, "Well, you're going to go to Stuttgart tomorrow." Stuttgart is a city in Germany, southeast of Frankfurt, I believe. And I said, "What for?" "Well, you have to go get your visa." I said, "What's a visa?" And she explained it to me. "Why?" "Because you're going to go to America." That was the first I knew about leaving Germany. And I don't know if she explained to me at that time or if I heard this sometime later on, but unbeknownst to me, in March of 1934, this youngest sister of my mother's, her name was Elsa, told my parents that at work she had found out that there is a group in the United States who is looking for children to come to the United States under their auspices in order to escape the Nazis. And my aunt was the private secretary to the person in charge of the Jewish welfare in Frankfurt. And that's how come she saw that correspondence. The paper said that the children need to be under 12 years of age. Their parents need to be supported by the welfare, and they need to be intelligence-wise the type of students that would go on to university and won't have that opportunity because of Hitler. Well, I didn't fit any of the categories. I was older, my parents were not on welfare, and as I've mentioned before, I certainly was not university material. But my father and mother said to her, "See what you can do." We have no one in America that would write affidavits for us. It would perhaps be one way of getting one of us out of the country at least. Whether it would help anybody else, we'll have to cross that bridge later, but at least a youngster would get out. So my aunt worked on that, and that's what happened. They accepted me. And that's why I needed to go to Stuttgart the next day to get my visa. This was in September, and by about the 25th or 27th of November the same year, I was on a boat coming to the United States with about 14 or 15 other children that the same group from America was bringing over. It was a group, there's again, my brother and I differ. I say it was the Felix Warburg Committee in New York City. At one time I had some papers that had that on it, but over the years with moving as many times as I have lost those papers, unfortunately. I've lost a lot of papers, which I wish now I had. At the time they were just so much garbage that needed to be moved every time I moved, and it got left behind. But my brother says it was one of the welfare organizations, strictly Jewish welfare, connected with a whole movement, not just a small splinter group as this Felix Warburg group was. But whatever it was, they brought me to this country, and we were to be placed as foster children with families in the United States. There was one other girl who was within the age limit that was requested from Frankfurt, who was leaving with me. And my mother was the chaperone for the both of us to take us to the ship.
Did you know her before?
No. She was about 3 or 4 years younger than I, so she was eligible as far as age was concerned. And I think her mother was a single mother, so perhaps she was on getting some help from the welfare. And I don't know how smart Hilda was in school. She was just a little kid, as far as I was concerned, that was tagging along. And as we went along, we met up with more youngsters that were going in this group. That's why my mother came along as the designated chaperone, because she saw to it that we picked up all these other kids on the way. And we eventually left from Bremen in the northern part of Germany.
As far as you know, there was not any difficulty securing the visa?
No, this had all been arranged through this Felix Warburg Committee. And this was in 1934, when things were still very easy.
Were you able to take whatever you wanted?
I probably could have, but I didn't, because I also was told that I'll be coming over to the United States for a year. And now in retrospect, I wished my mother would have given me more things of the family to bring along, but nothing. The only thing I did bring out was a little picture album I had made over the years with pictures of things that seemed interesting and important to me. And in fact, I brought it with me, but in looking through it, it really doesn't have all that much about my family in it. It's more about my friends and things like that. But that's one thing that has stayed with me these 58 years since I left home.
What do you think the reason was that she didn't give you more things?
Perhaps she was also convinced that I was going to be back within a year or so. I was 14 at the time. My birthday is in March. I left in November, so I was about 14 and a half. In fact, my father said to me at the railroad station, if you're not back by the time of your 16th birthday, you'll never see me alive again. So he was indicating that he hoped I would be back. Hope against hope that things would have blown over in Germany. And like I said, I was told that I was to leave only for a year. And I don't know whether that was just said to pacify me or if they really believed it. Also, who would give a 14-year-old child maybe pieces of jewelry or silver to take along? What does a 14-year-old kid know about the value of things like that? And a 14-year-old girl certainly wouldn't be the right person to take family linens along and things of this sort. I had one trunk, which happened to be one of the pieces of luggage that my mother used on her honeymoon, and one little hand suitcase. And it was primarily clothing. My mother did have quite a number of new things made for me during the time from September to November, so that I could leave with a good supply of clothing. I was just about as tall then as I am now, so she didn't have to be too concerned about things getting outgrown. And however, after I came over here, I found out that I looked like a country bumpkin in the things that I brought with me, which my mother thought were my mother didn't only think it, it was high fashion, well, not high fashion, but very adequate in style and everything, but so different from over here. For one thing, the things were mainly too warm, because we didn't have central heating in Germany, and you needed warm clothing. And here, well, you know from yourself that you go to school in summer clothes all year long, practically. And different countries, different habits, you know. So that's how I left Germany in the late November of 1934, and got to the United States on the 7th of December of 1934. So the 7th of December has always been an important date for me, long before Pearl Harbor. And
at the time that you found out you were leaving, from September to November, and then when you left, then what was your feeling about going? Was it still an adventure?
Oh yes, very much so, because they made me think that I was just going to be gone for a year. And also during that time then, I got a lot more permission to do things than was customary, because my parents realized, well, this may be the last time we can give her permission to do something like this. And just think of yourself, if you have a youngster in the early teens that is leaving, you would give that youngster a lot more leeway than if that youngster was not going to be leaving. So those last few weeks at home were marvelous. I got away with murder, and I enjoyed every minute of it. And
where was your brother at this time? Was he...
In 1933, my brother had gone to France to try to establish himself there because of Hitler trying to get out of Germany. Since he was older, there was no way that he could ever qualify for a children's transport. He was already, almost 20 years old. And he was in France for quite a while, but it was very difficult to get permission to stay in France. And he was no more successful than other people, potential immigrants. You had to have a working permit, and I doubt that he ever got it. He was always working behind some sort of facade. He had jobs of different kinds there, but he just couldn't stay, and he finally was told to leave the country, and he came back to Germany early in 1934. And I don't know where he worked, or maybe he was working for my father, I don't know. But after my brother got out of school, he went into an apprenticeship for business education, which was the customary thing at that time. And he finished that apprenticeship and had the certificate to prove it, and that's the way youngsters were educated. If I had been able to graduate from high school in Germany, I would eventually have gone into apprenticeship, probably as a seamstress or a household help or something like that, and then gotten a certificate upon completion of that course. And so my brother was at home again when I left. We had changed apartments in the meantime. Also, my parents had taken in a handicapped person for the extra income of room and board for this woman. And also our business had been moved into the apartment by that time. It was already in the old apartment, and then in the new one, the new apartment was rented with the idea of putting the business in. Before the Hitler times started, we had the office and everything in downtown in the business section of Frankfurt. I think I'd like to stop for a minute.
Before we move on to your arrival in the United States, Eric and maybe Joanna would just like to ask you a question or two about your life in Germany.
Okay.
Can you describe what the synagogue looked like that you went to? Do you remember what it looks like?
The men and women were separated. The women were upstairs, and the men downstairs, and the ark in the middle, facing east. It was a typical synagogue, nothing special. I don't recall how ornate it was or anything, but I imagine it had its shares of beautiful gold inlay and stuff like that. But in a way, it was always a chore for me to have to go to synagogue because I didn't understand the Hebrew that well, and it was just something that you had to do.
Was it a spectacular building or just
No,
regular?
no. It was not bombastic at all. It fitted in very nicely in the area where it was in the old part of the city, and it didn't stand out. I don't like for synagogues or anything to be built so that it doesn't fit in with the neighborhood. And this one certainly fitted in with the neighborhood very well. It had been there a long, long time.
You mentioned that anti-Semitism began to be felt in the business with your father. How specifically was that shown?
The orders didn't come in like they used to, and bills were not paid like they used to be. And a Jew didn't have any recourse to go after unpaid bills. There was just no sense in even trying. And those were the main areas. And I suppose also it became more difficult for my father to get supplies from Gentile suppliers. Anything else?
Okay. Can you describe the boat trip to the United States?
I wanted to die because I was so seasick. First of all, it was a very rough passage. It took 11 days, which was much longer than usually, because it being in November, it was very stormy. And almost from the minute that the boat started to move, I was seasick. And about the 6th day out, I guess, the stewardess came to my cabin. Also, we youngsters were in the 3rd class, which was no outside air and bunks and all that. There were 2 of us in one room. And it was very crowded. It was very difficult to try to dress or undress. So the first 6 days or so, I was just lying on my bed and didn't manage to go to the bathroom when necessary, but I didn't go to eat or anything, or very little. And the stewardess finally came and forced me to eat oatmeal and grapefruit. When she told me what she was going to make me eat when I got up, I shook my head, and she said, "Yes, you will." But I knew oatmeal from Germany, and it was always a fight to get me to eat it, so they never even tried anymore. And a grapefruit I didn't know at all. I had never heard of one, let alone seen one in Germany. And she tried to describe it to me. Well, it was something new, and I was always game to try something new. And of course, I didn't believe her that I would feel better after I'd eaten something, but she was right, and I did feel better. And from then on, the journey was a little better, And I was together with the other youngsters that were in my group. There was one boy from Berlin, a little bit older than myself. I never did find out how he got into the transport. But he and I became very well acquainted and kept up the acquaintance until he was killed in the Second World War.
What was his name?
Gerd Fenchel.
Spelling?
G. Do you want me to spell it?
Yes.
Oh, I thought you were going to write it down. The first name was Gerd, and the last name was Fenchel. Remind me later on when we start talking about my mother in Denver. I want to say something about Gerd again. And I have some small snapshots someplace at home, but I didn't bring them with me. It was just a bunch of youngsters futzing around on the ship. And when the weather was fairly decent, we were outside in the wind and the fresh air, and the rest of the time, I guess we spent the time somehow. I do remember that almost the whole time that I was eating, the sides of the tables were put up on shipboard. If this is the tabletop, there is always kind of a ledge that hangs down. It's on piano hinges. And if the weather gets bad, that is set up so that the cutlery and everything doesn't come off the table. And most of the time of that crossing, that was up on all the tables, because otherwise everything would have been just in our laps continuously.
Was it a German boat?
Yes. It was called the New York, from the Hapag line, which is a German shipping company, still in existence now.
And was there any problem with the ship gaining passage to be able to pass through wherever it had to go?
Not that I'm aware of. No, it was on one of its routine runs from Germany to New York.
Did not have a Nazi flag on it?
I don't recall. I couldn't tell you, I'm sorry. I almost doubt it, because it was 1934. And probably also, if it did have a Nazi flag on it when we left, they probably would have pulled it by the time we got to the States. I have no recollection of that whatsoever. I do remember that I was not being seasick, that I was not seasick when we were first able to sight the Statue of Liberty. And that I'd heard a little bit about that before I left home, and that really impressed me, that finally I got to see this. Once when I was sick with scarlet fever, my mother spent quite a bit of time with me. We were talking about different things, and one of the things she was telling me about was this United States of America, far away, and she was telling me that the only way that you could get there was by ship, and that was just so unbelievable. I said, well, Mother, that can't be. Somehow you have to be able to walk there. And she said, no. And at that time also she mentioned the Statue of Liberty, I recall that. And I remembered when I saw the Statue of Liberty that Mother and I had talked about that, and she certainly was right. You could not walk to the United States.
How long did the boat trip take?
11 days.
11 days.
It was supposed to have been only 7. So we did have a little bit of a storm, 4 days longer. And when I got here then, I don't remember who really met us officially, but an uncle of my cousin's, this Kitty Toha, whom I mentioned before, she had an uncle, a brother of her father's, who had lived in the United States since the early 1920s. He had come over after the First World War. And he was down at the boat to greet me.
What's his name?
Otto Ettlinger. And also one of my father's brothers had a couple lady friends in the United States. And one of those ladies was down at the dock to meet me, because I was going to stay with them the first few days. After I got here, I found out that the family that had agreed to take me as a foster child backed out of it at the last minute, and they didn't have a place to put me. So that's why I stayed in New York for a few days and stayed with these two ladies.
What was her name, do you recall?
I don't recall the first names. The last name was Katzenstein. Katzenstin. A good German Jewish name. And they introduced me to a number of their acquaintances, and that's where I first started to hear the phrase, "Oh, you must come to dinner sometime." And I'm still waiting for those invitations. You know how people will say, "We must get together," and nothing ever happens. But at that time, I was taking everything literally, whether it was said in German or in English. I imagine most of it was said in German because my English was very poor. I had had about a year of English instruction in Germany in school, but I disliked the language intensely. And I always said, I don't want to go to a country where I have to speak English, and I don't ever want to be a school teacher because the teachers in Germany were so atrocious. So, you know, I came and I'm talking English, or like my husband says, you're trying. And I have done my share of teaching too. I have a teacher certificate. And so you should never say, I won't ever do such and such, because that's invariably what you end up doing. And then after about a week, I think, of being in New York City, they did find a couple who had already contracted to take a boy. They had two small boys themselves, and they said, okay, we'll take this girl on a temporary basis until you find somebody, because I couldn't stay in New York any longer. There was no way of getting me into a school or anything. And this couple lived in the suburb of Philadelphia, Abington, Pennsylvania. And I went to them. The other boy, he was not on my transport, but, and I don't know how he came to the States, under whose auspices or what, but he was about a year younger than I, and he came from Nuremberg in Germany. His father had died, and his mother was alone, and he was an only child. His name was Peter Benario. And then this couple's last name was Klopfer, Klopfer. In fact, a nephew of theirs used to be a psychologist here at Portland State, Walter Klopfer. And the Klopfers had two little boys of their own, Peter and Tommy. They were about 2 and 4, something like that. And this couple had a nice little house in the suburb, and with 4 bedrooms, 1 bath, I think. It was a nice little house for that time, 1934. And I moved in there and started school, and I was put in the 8th grade, even though that was about 2 grades below what I came from, because I didn't know the English language, and I needed to take American history and things like that. In math and science, I was way ahead of my contemporaries in school there, because first of all, those were subjects that I had always enjoyed, and those were subjects for which you didn't necessarily need language skills. But it was in December that I started school, and then during the following summer, I went to summer school in order to catch up with some more so that I could go into high school the next September. But it was a great surprise to go to school here, a pleasant surprise, because the teachers were so different here. Not like what we were used to in Germany, where they, well, just the remark that this one teacher made about being my mother's daughter probably told you a little bit how different things were over there. The teachers were always very strict, and you couldn't have much of an opinion of your own. And also, if you happened to meet them downtown on the street, the girls had to curtsy, the boys had to bow down and take their hats off. And boy, if you didn't do it, you heard about it. There were times when I'd see a teacher from my school coming towards me downtown that I would cross the street in order not to have to do that, because it was just so distasteful to me that I should have to kowtow to someone. And here, of course, you all have gone to school here, and you know that it's a much more friendly and relaxed relationship between faculty and students. And the teachers were especially kind to me. Well, Peter went to the same school. We both went to the same school there. We two were the only refugees this little town had ever had any contact with. This was early on in 1934. They didn't even know that this Hitler over in Germany was having all these sinister ambitions. And it was difficult to make the kids and the faculty understand really why we were there. And they never did really understand until, I think most of the people, I know that my classmates didn't come to the realization of what I had escaped from and had gone through by being away from my family and everything until after the United States got into the war in December of '41. That's when suddenly they all became very much aware of it, and I'll touch on that a little bit later. And so we went to school and tried to learn English as quickly as possible. And I'd always been told that once you start dreaming in a foreign language, then you'll be able to get along. And that was really true. Once I stopped dreaming in German and was dreaming in English, then I wasn't afraid anymore to open my mouth, no matter how it came out. And I could understand most everything that was said to me. But the accent I never did lose. I've even taken speech lessons for that, and I just couldn't shake it. It would have been a help during the Second World War and also with teaching, but it wasn't to be. But the language did become easier, and as I said, then the following year I started high school, but because I was quite a bit older than the other ninth graders, they worked out a special program for me so that my classes really ranged over grades from 7 through 10 in order to catch up with civics and English grammar and things of this sort, and yet take the academic side of the curriculum, because they felt right away that I'd be able to go on into high school, and I had a background in mathematics already that was on the high school level, as well as in French and things of this sort. In Germany, once you pass the first 4 grades and you divide the student body into vocational and academic, you start foreign languages. So I started French already in the 5th grade. And English then was started in the 8th grade, I think. 8th grade, the equivalent of the 8th grade. So my French was, especially for beginning French here in the United States, was pretty decent. And school was fun for me here because, of course, I didn't have a youth organization that I belonged to that took all my attention and energies. I did spend quite a bit of time studying, and it wasn't difficult at all to get good grades here, and without even trying, I was on the honor roll most of the time. So I wish that teacher from Germany had been around later on. But
what was it like living with the Kloppers?
It was difficult at times. because I never quite knew, today, am I going to be treated like the daughter of the house or the maid of the house? And also, there was not too good a relationship between the husband and wife. And I was an early teenager, and there was a man who was still having roving eyes. And it was difficult at times. But I'm grateful that they took me in. I was with them until 1938. Unfortunately, the man died of Hodgkin's disease early in 1938. And I went through the whole illness with them. And when he became so ill, the doctor requested that we two foster children be moved out of the household, so that there would be less confusion for the patient. But the Klopfers both said that Peter to move out, that's fine, but Lotte is staying. She was thinking more, I think, in terms of being able to help, and he just wouldn't hear of my leaving. And the Klopfers had met and married for the sole purpose of producing 2 children. She was quite a bit older than he. They both came from Germany also. He came from a banking family in the southern part of Germany, Augsburg, and several generations ago that family already had converted to Catholicism from Judaism. And but he came to the United States in the middle 1926, 1920s, about 1926, I believe, to settle here. And he went into the banking business. He had also been a soldier in the First World War, and he, like the uncle that met me at the boat, could tell that things were not going to be very prosperous in Germany, and they emigrated. And at that time, it was not difficult to come into the United States. So he was pretty well established in the banking field, and she was a nurse specializing in pediatrics. And she, through the brother of this Mr. Klopfer that I stayed with, met this Mr. Klopfer, and they married for the sole purpose of having a family. And she, that way, was able to immigrate from Germany also to come to the United States, which suited her fine because her own mother had died when she was a child, and her father had remarried, and the stepmother was very mean to her, to the point that this young girl left home. And
was she Jewish?
Yes.
And did they live as Jews?
Yes.
In Philadelphia?
No, not they didn't object to my doing something about the Jewish holidays, but they themselves did not really keep any Jewish holidays or anything. They were more, they leaned more towards the Quakers. And they had their beliefs, and their children went to the Quaker school once they started school. And they had a number of acquaintances in the Quaker congregation, but they didn't go to the Quaker meetings either. It was kind of a non-religious type of setup. We did have a Christmas tree every year. That was the first time I was exposed to that, and it was fun.
But you continued to keep up with your Judaism?
Fairly much so. By the time I moved to Pennsylvania, I was under the auspices of the Jewish Committee, the Welfare Committee of Philadelphia. And they saw to it that I was invited for the high holidays by different people in the community. And out where I lived, that was quite a wealthy area. And especially among the Jews, there was a tremendous amount of wealth, and I'd be invited into these mansions for Rosh Hashanah and the evening of Yom Kippur and all that. And I was just completely out of my area.
Did you continue to keep kosher?
No, no. No, because I couldn't cook for myself. And to me, being kosher always was kind of a burden, though I didn't have to make many choices very often because I wasn't together with Gentiles that often, but I know that I was in non-kosher households at times. For instance, my mother's middle sister, with a cousin, they did not keep kosher. I don't think they had pork products in the house, but it was not kosher. I know it wasn't because we'd have milk with the main meal, milk and meat. And not milk to drink, but milk desserts, which I didn't like to drink milk at all in Germany because the milk was delivered raw to the house and we had to boil it ourselves. And 9 times out of 10, that milk that was being boiled would boil over. And if you have never smelled the smell of burning milk, you have missed something. Or seen the scum on the top of the milk after it has been boiled. So the only way they got milk into me was with a big bowl of chocolate pudding every evening.
What did you hear from your family in Germany that first year that you were in the States?
That things were difficult, but that physically they were well, and that they wanted to know what all I was doing. And I remember I pulled a nasty trick on my mother once. I wrote home that I had done the whole family's laundry on a Saturday, because I didn't tell her that we had a washing machine. The letter I got back, we didn't send you to the United States to become a laundry woman. Then I knew I was going to get a letter like that, but I just couldn't miss that opportunity. And then I went into detail describing a washing machine, which was something that we didn't know in Germany. And at that time, the washing machines here were the agitator type with the hand wringer over the top. It's much more work than it is now, but at that it was very good. And they had a live-in maid in that household also. So we were a household of 7 people. And also the laundry was done every week, not like in Germany where you did the laundry once ever so often, because every floor in the apartment house would have the laundry facilities at their disposal for 1 week. So in the last place where we lived, there were 5 stories. So every 5 weeks you could do your laundry, and it consisted of a big copper kettle in the basement where you would boil your things, and then another kettle in which you rinsed the things, and then you wrung the things out by hand as well as you could, and then you carried everything upstairs to the attic and hung it up in the attic with clothespins. And this maid of ours, which was the same as in every other household, she was the one that took care of that, but it took all week, because on Mondays I think she soaked, on Tuesdays she boiled, on Wednesdays she rinsed, and on Thursdays and Fridays it was hung up upstairs. So the week before always she tried to get things ready as far as eating was concerned that wouldn't take too much time during the week that she had the laundry. And my mother helped a little bit more in the kitchen during that time too, I think. But of course that is so different from anything that you're used to here. So that's why my mother was shocked when she heard I had done the laundry for 6 people. And
when did you begin to realize that you were going to be here more than 1 year?
About the end of the first year, 1935, when I was asking the committee what arrangements they had made for me to go back. But by that time, I had become more aware, too, of what was going on in Germany, because the Klopfers, both being of German descent, they found out things that were not necessarily in the newspapers, because they had other contacts. And she, being quite Jewish-oriented yet, even though she didn't keep a kosher household or do anything about the holidays, she was more aware of what was going on what was going on with the Jewish people in Frankfurt. in Germany, I mean. So I had become more aware of the fact that perhaps I shouldn't go back. And I did write to my aunt, the one through whom it was made possible for me to come to the States, if she, what this was all about, that I wasn't going to be able to come back in 1935. And I didn't get an answer from her, but I got an answer from my cousin's father, this Kitty's father. He wrote to me because my aunt had asked him, would you please write this letter to Lotte because I just can't do it. I lied to her. So Uncle Alfred wrote, and he traveled outside of Germany quite often. And he wrote to me one time when he was out of Germany at that time and explained to me that it would be ridiculous, it would be suicidal if I came back to Germany to live there because of what was going on. And then I talked it over with Mr. and Mrs. Klopfer, and they confirmed all that. And of course, it was a shock. And that's when I really realized that I may never see my brother or my parents again or any of my friends. And the things that should have gone through my mind when I first came to this country were going through my mind then, after I'd been here a year. And perhaps that was easier because at least I had the ability to communicate with other people in English by then. And well, I got adjusted to the idea. What else could I do? I saw the reasons and I didn't fight against it. I know of one person, one youngster, who could not take it being in the United States away from home, and he went back to Germany, but I don't know whatever became of him. But as a rule, I think probably almost 100% of the youngsters that were brought out did stay because of realizing what they would have to go back to.
Had you heard about the Nuremberg laws by that time?
I don't remember. I don't remember.
Was there any talk about your parents trying to leave?
No, because my father could never have gotten a visa to come into this country being an invalid. And my mother would not have left him. Besides, I hadn't made any contact with anyone that would give the affidavit for them. You want to stop?
Do you know if your brother was thinking about leaving?
Oh yes, because he had gone to France in 1933 already, remember? Yes, he would have loved to get out. And I don't know if he, well, we had no connections in the United States other than me, and I was a youngster. I couldn't give an affidavit for anybody. And I really, I don't think that I ever tried to make contact with anyone who would give an affidavit for my brother. I knew he was working and that he was living, and nobody ever said anything to me that I recall. And probably because I was so young. But it came more and more to my attention as to what was going on in Germany, of course. And especially because I lived with the people that I did live with. And before I mentioned this Gerd Fenchon, we were in contact with each other all the time. In fact, we met once or twice in New York City. He was placed with a family in Newburgh on the Hudson, which is not far from New York City, and I wasn't that far from New York City. And I remember at least once we met because I went to New York to spend a few days with the brother of these Klopfers. And Gerd came down from Newburgh. I imagine that he stayed someplace because we were together more than one day. And one time we went back down to the harbor because we knew that the New York was in port. and we were able to get on board, and some of the stewards remembered us, and we got to talking to them, and it was a lot of fun. I don't recall feeling any animosity from the German crew at that time. So if there was, it certainly didn't stay in my memory. But Gert and I had a good time going over some of the areas where we had been acquainted on that 11-day trip.
You said earlier that the placement at the Klopfers was temporary.
Yes, by the time they did find a place for me to go, the Klopfer said no, they had gotten used to having 2 foster children, they'd like to keep me. And that I seemed to fit in very well, and that it was nice to have a companion for Peter who was more his age, and also someone who was able to give a hand in the household now and then. And so I stayed, and that was all right with me. I didn't mind. At that time, I didn't feel any of the pressures that I experienced later on. And let's see, the summer of 1935 then, the Klopfers moved from Abington, Pennsylvania to Jenkintown, Pennsylvania, which is a little bit closer to the city itself. And we moved into a larger house there, because by that time it became quite evident that perhaps his parents were going to come and stay for longer periods of time, and they needed more space. And also the Klopfers had acquaintances in Germany who had teenage children whom they wanted to send to the United States. Some of them came on immigration visas, and some of them could only get visitors visas. But there were at least 2 girls who came and stayed with us for quite a while. And so that was one reason why they wanted to get a larger house. And it was a 3-story house then that we had, and I don't think we had a live-in maid then anymore. But it was a nice house. In fact, it is still standing now. I saw it just recently. And that's when I started high school then. And throughout all of my high school years, I went to summer school at Temple University in order to get the extra credits so that I could graduate with the class of 1938, which would have been the year I was 18. And most of my classes at Jenkintown were taken with that group of students. And I never felt as a part of that group, except with one girl. Her name was Margaret Wilson. She and I became quite well acquainted, and we lived in the same part, and we walked pathways to school together always. And we are still in contact, and through her I have had some nice experiences in Jenkintown. In 1988 was the 50th reunion of our graduation, and I went because I needed to get away from home. I'll get into that a little later, I hope. And at the banquet that evening, one of the evenings, they were giving out all sorts of awards. And they gave out one award for the most outstanding student of their class, the most outstanding classmate, they called it. It was in the program, didn't give any names of anyone. One of them was for one of the most world-known member of our class, and that turned out to be the admiral who was in charge of the ship when the first spaceship came back. He picked up the astronauts, and that was Carl Seiberling. He was one of our classmates, and that we could all figure out ahead of time. But when it came to announcing who the most outstanding classmate was, they chose me. And like I told them, I'm almost speechless. They said they couldn't believe that. But over the years, because of Margaret, with whom I was in contact all the time, they found out that what all I had done in my life, and also because of the war and becoming aware of what was going on in Europe when I came over, they then came to realize what it was that I had escaped from, and what it meant to have come over here by myself and living with strangers and all that. And at that time in 1988, that's when I felt, well, when I knew that I was really appreciated by my class members and part of the class. But when I was going to school with them, I didn't feel a part of them at all, except for this Margaret. I was never invited to any of the parties that were going on among the students and stuff. And I felt quite left out, but I was busy because I was studying. I was helping Mother's Club for at home quite a bit. And the studying still took quite a bit of my time. First of all, I was taking more than the regular load. And then in some subjects, I had to translate the English into German before I could really understand what the subject matter was about. And I had the vice principal and I had so hoped that the school board would accept my knowledge of German as part of my credits, but they wouldn't. I had to sit through 3 years of German in order to get credit for it. And I thought, well, that'll be all right. I'll use that hour every day as a study period. But the instructor also instructed Spanish and had a very active Spanish club. And he was much more interested in taking care of that. So quite often I'd find a note on the blackboard, would I please teach the class that day, because he was busy with his Spanish stuff, which didn't suit me at all, but you did what you had to do.
Were there other Jewish students in the school?
I think one, but like I said, there was never any contact, which was sad. But it was a fact of life there. And I'm in contact with some of the students, my former classmates now, on a much nicer basis, of course, than I used to be. And they were all very nice to me when I was there for the 50th reunion, and we all had a good time, not just me. It turned out to be a very good meeting.
How did the correspondence change, or did it change, between you and your family back in Germany as the years went by?
In 1938, there was one letter lost one time, but that was not because of the oppression or anything. That was because of the way my aunt wrote it, and that happened to be the letter in which she told me that my father had died. And I didn't hear anything for a long time. But other than that, I think the correspondence went on fairly regularly until Germany went into the war in 1939 in September. But even then, I still heard quite regularly from my mother, as long as she was not in a concentration camp. And let's see, how can we tie all this together? I mentioned before that my father died in 1938, and this one letter got lost. And in retrospect, then I found out that because in 1936, I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead. This was in 1936 when my father died. My mother had evidently gotten so desperate that she tried to commit suicide. And my brother fortunately found her before it was too late. She had taken an overdose of sleeping medication. And he got her into the hospital, but it was touch and go for quite a while. And because my father was so handicapped, he couldn't stay at home alone. By that time, this maid who had been with us so long had left because it was getting more and more difficult for her to be with a Jewish family. And our doctor put my father into the hospital And he knew that my mother had tried to commit suicide. They told him, and that they didn't know if she was going to pull through. It didn't look too hopeful. And he knew that if mother wouldn't come out of this, that there was no life for him because he depended on her so much because of his handicap. So he committed suicide in the hospital. And the letter that got lost was the one that said, "Your mother has tried to commit suicide. We're not sure if she will pull through, and your father has killed himself." That letter had gotten lost, and there were weeks and weeks that I didn't hear anything from home. As a rule, at that time, I was hearing about every 2 weeks. Mail took a lot longer then because it had to go by boat. There was no air mail. And so every 2 weeks was a good time span, and it was probably about 6 weeks that I didn't hear anything until this letter that had gotten lost did finally reach me. And that's when I heard it. And by that time, everything was over in Germany. But I did hear in the meantime from someone else, not from my mother, that my mother was going to pull through. And so all that kind of descended upon me at once. Though I was not surprised that my father had died, I just didn't expect him to commit suicide.
How did he do it?
I used to think that he took an overdose of sleeping pills, but it's only been within the last 5 years that I found out that he slashed his wrists.
In the hospital?
In the hospital.
And this was before he knew whether or not she would pull through?
That's right. Because it looked so bad for my mother. And he knew what was in store, what would be in store for him, especially a Jewish invalid. And he figured that, I guess he figured that this was the best way out. And it was after the time that he had told me that I wouldn't see him alive anymore.
You said your mother tried to commit suicide because of desperation about...
Financially, and what was happening to Jewish people in Germany. Mm-hmm. But as I said, she pulled through it, and that was in 1936. And she then gave up the apartment where we had been living, the one that I still knew, and moved someplace else and started to rent rooms and do room and board in earnest in order to keep herself in some income, because the business had been closed, or was in the only thing that you could do was to just let it die. There was nothing left there to rescue, and she couldn't have done it alone anyhow. And that's what she started to do then in 1936, after she got well enough again. And we were in contact all the time and wrote to each other. And I continued with my schooling here and tried to make the best of the situation and try to be as successful at it as I could, so that I could write home to Mother that things were going all right here. I realized that she needed a lot of encouragement. And then in 1938, in the spring of 1938, this Dr. Klopfer died of Hodgkin's disease. I guess it was in about 1937 that it was discovered. And he did have some radiation treatment in New York at that time, but trying to treat cancer in the 30s was really not feasible at all. But he did go through that. And at that time then also, he had wanted to increase his life insurance, but of course with the medical background then that he had, it couldn't be done. He realized he was going to die and leave a wife with 2 small children. So we moved into a different house in a more expensive area. And that was the time then that this Peter Benario did not move with us because of the illness of Mr. Klopfer and all that. And it was a good time to make a break. And I did move with them, and I stayed with them until, well, Hubert died then early 1938. And then in June of '38, I graduated from high school, and that was when Mrs. Klopfer had decided then to sell the house in Pennsylvania and move to California with the two small boys, because she did a little bit of sculpturing, and she thought that she was much better at it than she really was, and she wanted to get away from the East Coast, I think. And what's so funny?
The way that you said it.
Oh, I see. So anyhow,
Apparently didn't think she was as good as she thought.
That's right. Why, did I say it backwards?
No.
Oh, okay. But she was all set to make a living as a sculptor in Hollywood. Well, she ended up running a boarding house.
What did you do when she moved?
I went to college in Colorado, and this was an interesting situation. In the Christmas vacation of 1937, I visited Mr. Klopfer's brother and sister-in-law in New York City. This brother was a Dr. Bruno Klopfer, a psychologist, who had brought the Rorschach test with him from Berlin. They had immigrated to New York, and they were living in Yonkers, New York, and I spent part of my Christmas vacation with them. And that was another time also when the Gert Fenchel came down from Newburgh. That was when we went to see the New York ship. And the Klopfer said to me, if you want to meet a professor from a university from Colorado, come home from your date a little earlier. We're having a couple here. He is a professor from the school in Colorado and is on sabbatical and is taking psychology work from Bruno. Well, Colorado to me meant the Wild West. Cowboy hats, boots, you know, all the stuff that you saw in the movies. And yet a college professor, I was comparing him to college professors that I had known in Germany. Very dignified people. And I had to see this combination. So I came home early from my date, and I met this professor and his wife. Their name was Francis and Wallace Waite. And that's where the name Waite comes from. And by the time I got home, they had heard about me from the Klopfers and that I was getting ready to graduate from high school and that I should really be going on to college, but it was going to be difficult financially and all that because of not having a family or anything. And this Professor Waite was in educational psychology at what was then known as the Colorado State Teachers College in Greeley, Colorado. I think it's now called the Northern Colorado University or something like that. Anyhow, since that was a state college, the tuition, of course, was much less. I had applied for a scholarship at Temple University, but that wasn't decided yet anyhow. And he told me about the school, that it is much less expensive tuition-wise, and that it is customary on that campus that about 75% of the student body works in some capacity, and that it wouldn't be difficult at all for me to earn my room and board. And with the lower cost for the tuition, that perhaps I could work out something, and that they'd like to have me come to college in Colorado. Well, I said, well, thank you very much. And I thought of that, well, that's just like these people in 1934 that were saying to me, you must come to dinner sometime. And I forgot all about it, because it just sounded too unreal. And in February of 1938, the social worker who worked with me always from the Jewish Committee in Philadelphia came out one time and said, we've been contacted by this Professor Waite, and we've investigated him, and if you want to go to college, we will give our permission, and we will see to it that when you leave, you have all the bedding and clothing and things that you need in order to live in the dormitories, and we will give you $150 for each of the first 2 years, which should cover your tuition. I think it was 150 or whatever it was. They were going to pay the tuition for my first 2 years, which was also still the time that they were my legal guardian. And that if I wanted to do that, they would see to it that I could get out there to Colorado. By that time, I had found out that there was not going to be a possibility for me to get a scholarship at Temple, and besides, I still would have had the expense of living someplace, and working your way through college in Philadelphia, especially at Temple, was going to put me into an entirely different social class, and that working students at Temple University were looked down upon. Whereas I had the feeling at Greeley that was different, and it involved a lot less money. So I said, okay, I'll try it. And that's how I got to Greeley, Colorado in the summer of 1938. And this couple, this Wallace and Frances Waite, they became the Jewish Committee's representative for me.
Were they Jewish?
No. Mm-mm. And they would report back to them at times, and they were my contact and my, well, anything that came up I discussed with them. And they told me right away that they want me to feel at home in their home. In fact, they gave me a key right away to their house. But they don't want me to live with them because they feel that I need to be among my contemporaries in an English-speaking setting. They want me to live in the dormitory, and they helped me then make my first contacts to get a job to work for my room and board. And it was the summer vacation that I got there, so my first living at the dormitory was when it was really closed, but I did some cleaning there. And for a while I was helping a woman who had a cabin in the mountains in Colorado also. The Waites helped me quite a bit to get myself started there. And then when school started, when classes started in September, I enrolled as a freshman and kept working at the dormitories, which took care of my room and board, and waited on tables and helped clean the dormitories, and took a full load of, no, I didn't take a full load of classes. I took about 3/4 because I knew I was going to go to summer school. Wallace Waite worked that out with me and with the registrar also, so that within 4 years I would be able to get through. Oh, I forgot to say something. One thing, when I first met the Waites in New York, we did discuss a little bit what type of curriculum there is and everything. And Wallace told me that they have, that as a rule, after 2 years, the first 2 years after the sophomore year, a person can go out with a limited certificate and teach in rural schools and earn some money, and then come back in the summertime in order to pick up classes again and all that, that I would be able to earn money after my second year if I needed to, because I had hoped that by that time my mother was going to come to the United States and I needed to make a living for both of us. And he said, that shouldn't be any problem for you. And if it isn't necessary for you at the end of the 2 years to do that, then you just go on with the rest of your curriculum, which had been worked out so that I could take extra science classes in order to qualify for the internship of the American Dietetics Association. I had decided to become a dietitian and at the same time get a teaching certificate in home economics. So I took extra sciences in order to qualify for that internship. And by 1940, my mother was not going to be able to come, so I just went on to school and took some classes in the summertime also in order to pick up the hours that I couldn't take during the regular term, because I did all sorts of things. I one stretch I ironed shirts for a Episcopalian preacher in order to earn some money. I did babysitting, which was just getting started at that time. Babysitting was not a common thing when I was growing up. And like I said before, I've worked in the dormitories and in the dining rooms and at the faculty club. And I started to work at the switchboard, the college switchboard. And that became my permanent type of employment then while I was going to college. And I got to the top level, which was being in charge of the switchboard, which meant the scheduling of hours of the others and everything. And I had a real good salary of $1 for 3 hours of work. And that was good pay from 1938 until 1943.
Did the Waits have any children?
They had one adopted son. And he was a little developmentally handicapped, and he went to the experimental school on the campus, which we had there, and did quite well. He was very handy with tools and things. So, Mrs. Waite's mother was living with them also. And like I said before, I had the keys to their house and I could come and go at any time. And they very often heard about other jobs that were available and they'd tell me about it. And
am I right in assuming that your connection with the Waits was quite close, different than with the Klopfers?
Yes, very much so. It might have been the same with the Waits eventually if I had lived with them. But I know that Wallace Waite would never have treated me the way Mr. Klopfer treated me. That never would have happened.
Did Mr. Klopfer ever do anything? Or was it just roving eyes?
No, it was more than roving eyes.
Is that something you want to talk about?
Well, I was abused by him. And more than once. One summer also, she and the children had gone to Germany to visit the grandparents. And Peter and I were the only ones left at home with Mr. Klopfer. And that was not the most pleasant summer for me.
Was Peter also abused?
No.
Did he know?
I don't think so, because Hubert always made sure that Peter was out of the house when he wanted meat for himself.
You never told?
No. That's something, in fact, that I haven't mentioned until maybe the last 10 years. And it's over and done with. I came through it all right. So I always wonder what these things that I read about where adults that have been abused as children are now having to go into psychoanalysis and everything in order to get over that. For me, that took place once I left there. And it was something that was happening and you couldn't do anything about it. It was a situation for me that where if I didn't realize at that time, of course, nobody probably would have believed me anyhow, that if I had said something, I would have gone into a worse situation. How did I know if the committee was going to place me someplace else? Maybe things were going to be worse. Here I knew what I had to put up with, and so be it. And then, of course, that he died, then I knew that it was going to stop with his death. In fact, it stopped long before that because of his illness. But it was something that I was glad to get away from, but not something that kept preying on my mind all the time. I had more important things to do. Life had to go on, and by that time, of course, I felt by the time I went to college, I felt that it was really necessary for me to make contact with people to bring some of my family over, what was left. And that was one thing that I talked to the Waits about very early on when I got to Colorado in the summer of 1938. and told them that in the meantime my brother had gotten married, and his wife had a sister and parents, and they of course needed to come out, and then there was my mother left and my brother and his wife. And the Waits said, well, we don't have enough in order to sponsor everything. We would probably be able to write affidavits for 2 people, and we'll give affidavits for the young people, because it's their future that is going to be killed. In other words, they would give affidavits for my brother and his wife when the time comes.
How would one know when the time comes?
Well, the time came when I had my first letter from my mother after Kristallnacht, which was in November of '38. And I got to Greeley in the summer of '38.
Could we stop here and